I remember the exact moment I felt that first twinge of doubt about Claire. It was a Thursday evening, and everything seemed perfectly normal at a glance. We'd both come home a little later than usual and were trying to salvage a cozy night in. The lights in our living room glowed softly, and the hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen provided a background rhythm that felt oddly comforting. At least, it had until that moment. I was sitting cross-legged on the couch, flipping through channels, half listening for Claire to finish in the bathroom so we could settle down together. That's when a muffled chime made my ears perk up. I glanced at Claire's phone on the coffee table. It was silent. A second chime, more persistent than the first, echoed from somewhere else. My chest tightened just a bit as I stood up, noticing Claire's phone still lying untouched where she'd left it. So what was ringing? I followed the faint sound to the hallway. The noise led me to the small closet by the front door. My pulse gave a little jolt. I never heard Claire's phone make that particular sound before, and we rarely put anything in that closet except coats or boxes of old magazines. It seemed so strange that she'd stash her phone in there, behind a half-closed door. "Claire!" I called out, my voice reverberating against the hallway walls. She didn't respond. I could hear the water running in the bathroom, so I figured she might not have heard me. I stood there with my hand on the closet doorknob for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I eased it open. Inside, among the half-buried winter gear, I spotted a small bag. The screen of a phone, definitely not Claire's usual one, lit up through the mesh pocket. My mind raced. I'd never seen a second phone of hers before. The logical side of me tried to reason. Maybe she borrowed someone's phone, or it's a work device she forgot to mention. Except Claire never kept secrets like that, at least not in our 7 years of marriage. I froze there, my thoughts colliding in slow motion. That's when I heard a slight shuffle behind me. Claire was standing at the end of the hallway, hair damp, wearing a simple pair of shorts and an oversized t-shirt. She had thrown on the outfit so quickly that the collar hung off one shoulder. The light from the bathroom cast a slight glow around her, accenting the look of alarm that flickered across her face. "David," she said, sounding almost breathless. "What are you doing in there?" There was a tightness to her voice that I didn't recognize, as though she were caught off guard. Usually, she'd walk over, kiss me on the cheek, and ask if I wanted to watch a show or maybe order something to eat. But tonight, she hovered by the bathroom door with her hand gripping the handle. My mind circled around a single question. Why would she hide a phone in the closet? I cleared my throat, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a phone in here." It kept ringing. She blinked once, twice, and then that flicker of surprise was gone. "Oh, well, it's just an old one," she said. Her words came out too quickly, like she'd rehearsed them. Probably just some spam calls. I stared at her, trying to read the expression on her face, but she kept her gaze locked on the phone in my hand. Something about the moment felt off, like we weren't standing in our own hallway, like the entire atmosphere had shifted. Her eyes darted toward the living room, then back at me. She walked forward, taking slow steps, and carefully took the phone from my hand. "Let's just put that away," she mumbled, her tone clipped. Without another word, she slipped it into the pocket of her shorts. I didn't press her further, not yet, but my mind buzzed with questions. Claire might have a perfectly good explanation, but it was the strain in her voice that triggered alarm bells in my head. I was used to us being open with each other. Even if a call came in late at night, we'd occasionally joke about telemarketers or share a quick glance, just to confirm we were on the same page. This was different. Determined not to jump to conclusions too fast, I forced a smile and motioned for us to head back to the living room. She gave a nod, and we walked side by side in silence. Once there, we settled onto the couch, but the comfortable quiet that usually wrapped around us had vanished. The air felt thick, pressed down by unspoken questions. The TV was still buzzing with half-finished commercials. Neither of us looked at the screen. That's when my eyes caught sight of Claire's usual phone still lying on the coffee table, exactly where she'd left it. I felt a wave of confusion. If she already had her phone here, what was the other device for? She must have noticed my glance because she reached over, picked up her phone, and began scrolling through it with a focus that seemed deliberate. Like she was trying to look busy, too busy to talk about the new tension that had settled between us. It struck me as strange how quickly she was willing to drop the subject of the phone in the closet. I tried to look calm, but on the inside, my pulse was pounding. This was my wife. We'd built a life together. We laughed at inside jokes, finished each other's sentences, and held each other close on weekend mornings. Yet now, there was a gulf between us that hadn't been there before, and it was terrifying how easily it had opened up in a matter of minutes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I glanced around the room, hoping to spot anything that might fill the silence. That's when my eyes landed on something else. A thin smear on Claire's left shoe. It looked like a splotch of mud or clay, maybe from outside, but she'd always been careful about not bringing in dirt from wherever she'd been. It made me wonder where she might have gone before coming home. The question died on my tongue when she suddenly set aside her usual phone and turned to me, her face perfectly still. "What?" she asked. I wanted to say nothing, but the words stuck in my throat. I exhaled slowly. "I heard a buzzing from the closet," I repeated. "I just wanted to check it out. It's not like you to keep a second phone, Claire. You never mentioned it." She pressed her lips together, taking a moment that felt way too long before answering. "It's just an older phone. I didn't think it mattered." I could sense the tension thickening. In the corner of my eye, I noticed the curtains flutter by the open window, letting in the distant sounds of traffic. The air had a crisp chill that brushed against my skin and made me tense up even more. Before I could think of what to say next, Claire pushed off the couch and took a step toward the hallway. "I'm going to put this phone back in the closet," she said, sounding resolute, like she'd come to a decision. "We can talk after I do that." "Okay." I nodded, not sure what else to do, but as soon as she vanished from the living room, a prickle of unease spread across my neck. She was brushing this off too quickly, acting like it was trivial, even though I could see the anxiety flickering beneath her eyes. A spiral of suspicion began to coil in my mind, and every sense felt heightened. Something was definitely wrong. I stayed there, motionless, as the house fell unnervingly silent. Seconds later, I heard footsteps again. But instead of returning to me on the couch, I heard the front door open, a rush of cool air sweeping in. My heart jolted. Why would she go outside with that phone? Panic flooded me, and I leapt to my feet. In a flash, I was at the window, peering through the curtains. Claire stood on the driveway, lit by the faint glow of a street lamp. Her head was bent low, like she was studying the phone screen. She tapped at it once, glanced around as though making sure no one was watching, and then raised it to her ear. She was making a call. Without me. Without explanation. And she seemed guilty? Nervous. I pressed my forehead to the glass, straining to hear any snippet of conversation, but I could only see her lips moving in the muted orange light. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Finally, Claire turned, walked back to the front door, and disappeared from my line of sight. My mind spun 100 different scenarios, each more alarming than the last. By the time she stepped back into the living room, a facade of composure had returned to her face. She looked at me quietly for a moment, then said, "Everything's fine, David. It's handled." I didn't believe her. Not for a second. But before I could confront her, her phone, her usual one, lit up on the table. She grabbed it, shooting me a glance that was part panic, part defiance. And that's when the message popped onto the screen, a name I'd never heard before, followed by a string of words that made my chest seize up. She slammed the phone against her side, as if hoping I hadn't seen it. But it was too late. In that split second, I realized that I might be looking at the first sign that everything I believed about our marriage was about to crumble. And then she said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "David, can we please not do this tonight?" My world tilted. Because right then, I knew beyond any doubt. Something was very, very wrong. I couldn't get the image of that second phone out of my head. Even after Claire and I had a tense, silent dinner that night, half of which I don't even remember tasting, I replayed the moment I discovered it in the closet over and over. It was like someone had pressed a flashing neon sign into the back of my mind, telling me something was very wrong and refusing to let me ignore it. The next day, she acted like nothing had happened, smiling through our usual morning routine. But I couldn't forget how she'd gone outside with that phone, made a mysterious call, then brushed me off like I was overreacting. It was too strange to be a coincidence. At first, I thought maybe I was paranoid, seeing conspiracies where there were none. But it didn't take long for me to notice another strange pattern, one that made the gnawing dread in my gut feel more than justified. That evening, she came home later than her usual time. I was in the kitchen, trying to distract myself by tidying up, but every small noise outside made me perk my ears, waiting. When the front door finally creaked open, it was nearly an hour beyond when she'd normally arrive. I forced myself to stay calm, to not jump to conclusions. Then I noticed that her shoulders were hunched, and she was cradling something beneath her coat like she didn't want me to see it. The moment she spotted me in the doorway, she froze. We stared at each other for a heartbeat, the hum of the refrigerator in the background the only noise in the stillness. Then she quickly clutched the coat tighter against her body and brushed past me, muttering something about needing to put her things away. I wasn't about to let this slide. The tension had been crackling between us since the night before, and it felt like we were teetering on a precipice. So I followed her down the hallway, keeping my steps light, heart pounding in my throat. I watched her slip into the spare room we barely used, normally reserved for storage or the occasional guest. Quietly, I pressed my ear to the door. Inside, I heard the rustling of fabric and a soft thump, like she'd set something down. A wave of panic washed over me. I didn't want to believe she was hiding more secrets, but my instincts told me otherwise. I stood there, waiting, while she paced around inside. Finally, the doorknob turned. I barely had time to step away before she emerged, the coat slung over her arm like it was harmless. She nearly jumped upon finding me standing there. "David," she said, eyes darting anywhere but at my face. I thought you'd be in the living room." I managed. "But I heard you come in." Her gaze flicked to the door behind her. "I just needed to stash some files. You know, from the office." I offered the smallest of nods, not daring to press her yet. My thoughts churned. More phone calls, hidden items, now files being guarded in the spare room? The entire situation felt surreal. She squeezed past me, leaving the faint sound of her footsteps trailing toward the living room. Part of me wanted to chase her down, confront her on the spot, demand answers. But the other part needed concrete proof, something undeniable that wouldn't let her slip away with another vague excuse. I inhaled sharply, turned the doorknob, and stepped into the spare room. My heartbeat thundered. The lights were off, but a strip of streetlight shimmered through the blinds, enough for me to see shapes and outlines. Carefully, I inched forward. My foot nudged something on the floor, a small bag, half-zipped. I crouched down and reached inside, my fingers brushing against something smooth and metallic. Pulling it out, I realized it was an unfamiliar key, a key attached to a ring with the name of a local hotel etched on a small tag. My pulse kicked harder. I let the beam of the street lamp illuminate the tag. Sunset Lodge, room 312. My hands started shaking. This definitely wasn't some random file from her job. A chill crawled along the back of my neck. Could it be that she stayed at a hotel recently? A million questions bombarded my thoughts. Why would she need a hotel key when we lived together? Who had she met there? Quietly, I put the key back and zipped the bag, forcing myself to keep calm. If Claire was indeed having an affair, then this was my first tangible piece of evidence. My worst fear was coming true, right there in my hands. Even as I tried to cling to the hope that maybe there was a harmless explanation, a grim certainty settled into my bones. You don't hide a hotel key from your own spouse without reason. As I stepped back into the hallway, everything felt sharper. The lights, the the sounds of late-night traffic drifting through the windows, even the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. My chest felt tight, and my thoughts spun in circles. Was this the final piece? Or would there be more betrayals if I kept digging? I found Claire in the living room, perched on the edge of the couch, phone in hand. She stiffened when I entered, forcing what looked like a tense smile. "Are you hungry? We could." "I'm fine," I cut her off gently, my voice betraying the flurry of emotions inside me. "What did you just hide in the spare room?" Her eyes widened ever so slightly. "I told you. They're just office documents." That single denial sent a surge of raw anger through my veins. I didn't want to play cat and mouse. My mind flashed back to the phone in the closet, the suspicious call on the driveway, and now this hotel key. It was time to confront the truth, even if it destroyed me. "Office documents," I repeated, stepping closer. I locked my gaze on hers. "Are you sure about that?" She held my stare for a moment, then broke it, glancing at her phone screen. "Look, can we talk about this later? I'm tired. I've got a lot on my plate right now." That was enough. I marched back to the spare room, snagged the bag off the floor, and returned to the living room. Dropping it onto the coffee table, I unzipped it in front of her. With trembling hands, I pulled out the hotel key. The silence in the room was deafening. Her face went pale. "David, wait." I shook my head, my own heartbeat pulsing in my ears. "This doesn't look like office documents to me." The words tumbled out, thick with the pain I'd been trying so hard to contain. "Room 312, Sunset Lodge. That's what you're hiding. Care to explain?" Claire stood up, her entire posture rigid. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Eventually, she inhaled, struggling to maintain composure. It's not what it looks like." I let out a bitter laugh that sounded foreign to my own ears. "Then what is it?" In the pit of my stomach, I already suspected the answer. Her breathing grew unsteady. Her eyes darted toward her phone, as though it might save her from this conversation. When she finally spoke, her voice wavered. "It's complicated." A dull ache spread through my chest. "Then uncomplicate it for me. Talk. Now." She didn't move. For a moment, I half expected her to spin some elaborate story, but the silence that followed was more damning than any confession could have been. In that quiet, my mind conjured images of her with another person in that hotel room, of shared whispers and hidden rendezvous. My heart pounded so violently that I was sure she could hear it. I held up the key, tears of frustration pricking at my eyes. "You're meeting someone else, aren't you?" A wave of tension rolled off her as she squeezed her eyes shut. Her silence confirmed it. The world seemed to tilt under my feet. Even though part of me had been bracing for this possibility, hearing the unspoken truth felt like a sledgehammer to my chest. I set the key on the table with a shaky hand. "How long?" I croaked out. She still wouldn't answer, just looked at me with guilt and something else, maybe regret, etched across her face. I took a step back, a surge of betrayal and anger clawing at my insides. The details of the last few months flashed in my mind. Odd phone calls, cryptic messages, her abrupt changes in mood. It all made sense in a way I despised. Yet as the ache in my chest twisted into something raw, a strange calm washed over me. At least now I had confirmation. Tangible proof that the person I loved most had broken our trust. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet and broken. "I never meant to hurt you." Those words sent a jolt of pain straight through me. We'd built our lives around each other. We'd shared dreams, secrets, and promises. And now, with a single key, it felt like everything we had was about to collapse. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to block out the swirl of anger, sadness, and disbelief. "Then why?" I demanded, voice trembling. "What did I do wrong?" She opened her mouth to respond but couldn't. Tears shimmered in her eyes, and she turned away, letting the hush of the living room envelop us once more. For a moment, I just stood there, the reality of her betrayal crushing me. The taste of heartbreak weighed heavy on my tongue, and my shoulders trembled. Finally, I forced myself to inhale. "Claire," I said, voice cracking. "I need you to tell me the truth." She stayed silent, only managing a slow shake of her head. That non-answer was loud enough to shatter any remaining hope. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. "If you walk out right now, we might never fix this. But if you stay and talk to me," my words trailed off. "Could we fix something so broken?" My mind wavered between desperation and the realization that maybe it was already too late. She drew a shaky breath, but before she could speak, the phone in her hand vibrated. Her eyes flickered to the screen, and her expression changed, an anxious, almost fearful look. Then she slipped the phone into her pocket, as if wanting to hide yet another secret. I stared at her, my voice suddenly calm with a forced resolve. "Answer it. Or let me answer it. Prove that there's nothing else to hide." She hesitated, turning her gaze away from me. The phone silenced itself. I didn't move. My world felt like it was spinning in slow motion. Every second that passed seemed to hammer home the truth of what she'd done. Then, with eyes brimming with unshed tears, she took one step toward me. "David, That's when my own phone lit up on the kitchen counter, a piercing ring slicing through the tension. Confused, I broke eye contact with her and walked over, picking it up. The caller ID displayed a name I didn't recognize, and for some reason, dread coiled in my stomach. I answered, my voice wavering. "Hello?" A low voice responded, tense and urgent. "Is Claire there?" "She's not picking up." My heart lurched. I looked over to find her pale and tense, as if she already knew who it was. Her reaction said more than any confession could. In that instant, the entire precarious situation we were in teetered on a knife's edge. I opened my mouth to demand answers, but my throat felt too tight to speak. And I saw in her eyes the unmistakable admission. There was somebody else, and I was now face to face with that reality. The phone slipped from my grasp, landing on the counter with a dull thud. My voice shook as I managed 2 words. "Who are you?" The caller's voice still echoed in my ear, even as the phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the counter. I stood there, breath shallow, heart pounding. Claire was just a few steps away from me, her gaze locking onto mine. She knew exactly who had been on the other end of that line, and the tension between us felt like a physical wall I couldn't break through. I forced out a breath and picked up the phone again, speaker button still glowing. "Hello," I repeated, my voice thick with dread. It felt like the last time I'd ever want to ask that question, but I needed to do it. I needed to confirm who was calling my wife, and why they had my number. A tense silence stretched out for a moment before the same voice responded, taut with urgency. "Claire. Is she there? Look, this is important." I glanced at my wife, whose entire body was visibly shaking. She looked frozen, torn between grabbing the phone and running for the door. My voice came out hollow. "She's here. Who are you?" A pause. Then, "My name's Eric." No last name, no explanation. Just that one syllable that landed like a weight in the pit of my stomach. "I need to talk to her." I caught the flicker of panic in Claire's eyes as she darted forward, hand outstretched. "David, give it to me," she whispered, sounding almost desperate. I held the phone just out of her reach. My heart thundered in my chest, but I kept my voice surprisingly steady. "No," I said, letting out a ragged breath. "Whatever you two have been hiding, it ends tonight. If you won't talk, maybe he will." Her expression twisted into something pained, but she stayed silent, lips pressed tight. In that moment, I realized that hearing Eric's voice had changed something in me. I'd been paralyzed by suspicion and dread for days, but now there was no denying that my wife was involved with another man. Anger mingled with heartbreak, fueling me to push for the truth. I raised the phone to my ear, my voice shaking. "Eric, this is Claire's husband. If you have something to say, Say it now. He exhaled, loud enough for me to hear through the line. I'm sorry, he muttered. I tried to give Claire space to handle this, but we can't keep doing this. Not like this. That single statement was a punch to my gut. We can't keep doing this. My breathing grew ragged, and I fought the urge to smash the phone right there on the counter. I risked a glance at Claire. Her face had gone pale, and tears shone in her eyes. With trembling hands, she finally reached for the device again. Please, she said, voice cracking, just let me talk to him. I stared at her, the entire weight of her betrayal hitting me like a tidal wave. But I couldn't bring myself to be cruel, not yet. Without a word, I held the phone out. She clutched it and took a few steps away, pressing it to her ear. My mind buzzed with questions, none of which I could form out loud. All I could do was watch as she whispered something I couldn't fully make out. Her voice trembled, but she managed to keep it low, quiet, even if her eyes brimmed with guilt. After a moment, she ended the call with a shaky tap of the screen and stood there, phone in hand, as if bracing herself. The air in the kitchen felt suffocating, the fluorescent overhead light casting harsh shadows across her face. She finally lifted her gaze, and I saw sheer desperation in her eyes. David, she began, voice hoarse, I'm so sorry. Those words did nothing to lessen the ache in my chest. I swallowed hard, crossing my arms in a poor attempt to keep myself together. How long has this been going on? I asked, and in that moment, it was like someone else's voice had taken over my body. Calm, level, nothing like the storm raging inside my head. She drew in a ragged breath, glancing away. Not long, she said softly, then winced, as if even that admission cut her. A few months. A few months. The phrase repeated in my head like a broken record, each echo making my pulse race faster. A few months of lies, sneaking around, burying secrets in the closet and spare room. A few months where I'd been living a life half-grounded in a reality I never even saw unfolding. Why? I asked, voice cracking. That was the question clawing at me. What had gone so wrong that she felt the need to betray me? She stared at the floor, as though searching for words in the pattern of the tiles. I don't know, she admitted finally, eyes glistening. It just happened. We connected, and I was confused. I never planned for this. I felt something twist inside me, an anger that battled with heartbreak. I wanted to scream, to demand how she could throw away everything we'd built over some random confusion. Instead, I found myself shaking my head slowly, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. You didn't plan it, I echoed. But you kept at it. You lied to me, you hid things. So don't tell me it just happened. She flinched, like I'd slapped her. For a second, neither of us spoke. My hands were clenched into fists at my sides, trying to keep my voice steady. If I lost control now, I was afraid I'd say or do something I couldn't take back. In the silence, the house seemed impossibly still. I became hyper-aware of the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing by outside, the quick, shallow rhythm of my own breathing. Finally, Claire set the phone on the counter, her shoulders slumping. She sank down onto one of the kitchen stools, burying her face in her hands. I know, she whispered, so quietly I had to strain to hear. I know how terrible this is. I never wanted to hurt you, David. I didn't know how to stop. A tide of anger surged inside me. How to stop? I echoed, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. You make a choice, Claire. You say no. You say it's over. You don't meet him at a hotel. You don't sneak around with a second phone. She winced again, tears streaking her cheeks now. I'm sorry, she repeated, like that was all she could say. I let out a trembling breath. Every fiber in my being wanted to demand more details, to ask her exactly where, when, how many times, and who initiated it. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I wanted those images burned into my memory. The knowledge I already had felt like more than enough to tear me apart. Tell me about Eric, I said instead, my voice quieter, dangerously calm. Who is he, and what does he mean to you? She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, gaze unfocused. He works in a different department. We barely noticed each other at first, but then we got paired on a few projects, and we started talking. One day, he confided in me about some personal struggles he was going through, and I got wrapped up in trying to help him. It spiraled from there, and She swallowed, unable to finish. My stomach churned, imagining those late-night messages she might have sent him, the stolen moments in his car or at a coffee shop. The intangible intimacy that I thought was ours alone, shared with someone else. How many times? I asked, my voice faltering despite my attempt to appear strong. Claire closed her eyes. David, please. How many times? I repeated, each word like a hammer blow. She breathed in sharply. A few, she finally managed, her voice cracking. We met at that hotel, sometimes after things at the office. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing myself to keep standing, to not crumble. I didn't know if I was more devastated by the betrayal itself or the final confirmation of my worst fears. For a split second, I felt an almost out-of-body calm, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. The gravity of her words pressed down on me. Months of betrayal. A clandestine phone. A hidden bag. A hotel key. And worst of all, the woman I loved sitting there, begging for forgiveness, her face a mask of remorse and confusion. Finally, I opened my eyes. So what now? I asked, voice rough. Is it over with him, or am I supposed to just look the other way? She shook her head fiercely, tears spilling fresh. I ended it. I swear. I was going to tell him tonight that I couldn't do this anymore. That's why he was calling. He wanted to know what was happening. I was afraid. I was afraid to face you. Her words sliced through the haze of my anger. The irony was almost laughable. She'd been too scared to admit her wrongdoing, even though continuing the lie was what really destroyed us. You were afraid to face me, but not afraid to do what you did behind my back, I said quietly, bitterness heavy in my tone. She buried her face in her hands again, sobbing. For a few seconds, I just stood there, watching her cry, feeling a glacial coldness creep through me. I wanted to comfort her as much as I wanted to walk out the door and never come back. My heart ached with 1,000 conflicting emotions, none of them easy to untangle. Slowly, she looked up, reaching for my hand. Please believe me. It's over now. I'm done with him. I need you to forgive me, or at least try to. I didn't move, didn't take her hand. Instead, I stared at the phone on the counter, remembering the voice on the other end. Eric, sounding urgent, concerned, maybe even apologetic. My thoughts churned with an overwhelming mixture of heartbreak, anger, and a grim sort of relief that the secrets were finally in the open. But could I trust her again? A flicker of resolve sparked in my chest. One thing was sure. I couldn't pretend everything would be all right in a day, a week, or maybe ever. I needed time to process this tidal wave of betrayal. I forced myself to meet her gaze. Claire, I said, and my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. I'm not sure I can believe you just yet. You've said too many things that turned out to be lies. And right now, I don't know if I can handle this. She inhaled a shaky breath, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I understand, she whispered. What can I do? My jaw clenched as I took in the desperation on her face. I don't know, I answered honestly. But maybe you could start by giving me space. Let me breathe, let me think. I can't just snap my fingers and fix what you broke. She nodded, her chin trembling, and I felt a pang of sympathy despite my anger. For so long, she had been my partner in everything. I never imagined we'd be on opposite sides of a heartbreak like this. I moved to leave the kitchen, not trusting myself to say or do anything more. But then she spoke up again, voice trembling. David, I am so sorry. Whatever you need. If it's time, if it's distance, I'll give it to you. I paused at the threshold, my back to her, eyes stinging with tears I refused to let fall. Part of me wanted to believe her, to think that maybe this nightmare could somehow lead us to a new beginning. But the raw hurt was too intense to see a clear path forward. For a moment, the only sound was the muffled drip of the kitchen faucet and our uneven breaths. Then I said quietly, "I'll let you know what I need once I figure it out." Without waiting for a response, I stepped into the hallway. But as I reached for the banister, a sharp rapping on the front door made me freeze. My eyes flicked to Claire, who stood silhouetted in the kitchen, her tear-stained face etched with fresh panic. The knock came again, louder this time. Neither of us moved for a few heartbeats. The tension soared into dizzying heights. Who on earth would be knocking at our door now, especially after that phone call? My mind raced with sudden alarm, a dreadful thought forming. Did Eric come here? With my pulse hammering in my ears, I started toward the door, not knowing what I'd do if my worst suspicion was true. Claire took a shaky step behind me, one hand pressed to her mouth. All the lights seemed sharper, the air heavier, as if we were crossing into a scene we couldn't escape. The knock sounded a third time, insistent and unyielding. I braced myself, torn between fury and fear, ready for anything. Because in that moment, I realized our nightmare might only be beginning. I yanked the front door open, heart rattling in my chest, convinced I was about to come face to face with Eric. The porch light made everything seem sharper, the shadow of our small ornamental tree on the lawn, the shimmer of distant headlights passing by on the street, the beads of sweat on my own forehead. But instead of the dark-haired stranger I expected, I found myself staring at a woman, someone I'd never seen before. Her hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her expression was a mixture of worry and determination. She looked like she'd bolted straight from her car to our house, breath ragged from a swift walk. "Is Claire here?" she asked, voice taut with urgency. "I have to see her." My heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" I managed. My voice came out harsher than intended. She hesitated, eyes flicking from me to the dimly lit hallway behind me. "My name's Melissa." She paused, swallowing hard. "I work with Eric. Please, just let me talk to Claire." The name Eric sent fresh anger coursing through my veins. I turned slightly, glancing back to where Claire stood in the hallway, her face ashen. She'd followed me to the door, and when she heard Melissa speak, her eyes went wide, dread written all over her features. "Claire," I said, stepping aside. "She's here to see you." Claire came forward, hugging herself as though trying to hold in every emotion threatening to spill out. "Melissa," she whispered, clearly recognizing her. Why are you here?" Melissa's gaze darted toward me. "I'm sorry to barge in like this, but Eric called me. He said he'd spoken to you." She paused, letting out a shaky exhale. "He's worried." "I'm worried." "Worried?" I echoed, my anger flaring at the idea that Eric had people checking on Claire, my wife, in my own home. "What exactly are you worried about?" Melissa pressed her lips together, then directed her words to Claire. "He said everything blew up tonight. He said you'd finally told your husband about all of it." She cast me a sidelong glance, and I fought the urge to ball my hands into fists. "Eric thinks you're in danger." "In danger?" My voice cracked with disbelief. "What, does he think I'm some monster who's going to?" I stopped, biting down on my anger, trying to reel myself in before I said something I'd regret. Claire shook her head frantically. "Melissa, that's not what's happening. David isn't hurting me. This is our marriage, our mess. Eric needs to stay out of it." Melissa's gaze lingered on me, as though measuring my reaction. Eventually, she nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "Look," she said, tone gentler, "I'm not here to accuse anyone. I just wanted to make sure Claire was safe. Eric's been pacing around the office, talking about how she cut things off, how it all went wrong." A spike of adrenaline rushed through me at those words, cut things off, my mind spun back to the conversation Claire and I had barely 10 minutes ago. Her admission that she was done with Eric, that she never intended to let it go this far. 1,000 questions surged to the surface, but I couldn't form a single coherent one. I felt trapped in a whirlwind of fresh betrayal, half-formed relief, and raw fury. Claire's shoulders sagged. "I'm fine," she repeated, voice shaking. "Melissa, I'm sorry Eric roped you into this, but we need to handle this on our own." Melissa looked unconvinced. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Claire, you need to be sure about what you want. Eric's told me things that make me wonder if you're really ready to give this up." Her eyes flicked to me, then back to Claire. "He thinks the two of you had something real." I felt every muscle in my body tense at that. "Oh, you mean sneaking around behind my back?" I snapped, more venom in my tone than I intended. Claire winced, tears glistening in her eyes. "It was a mistake," she said, voice trembling. "I told Eric it was over. I told him I'm staying with David." That final sentence hit me like a blunt blow. I'm staying with David, the truth was, I didn't even know if I wanted her to stay. My mind churned with all the betrayal of the past few hours, the images of the hidden phone, the hotel key, the whispered phone calls. How could I be sure she wouldn't do it again? Melissa folded her arms, glancing between us. "Well," she said carefully, "Eric's upset. He can't believe you're suddenly ending it after everything. He keeps saying you made promises." Claire's lip quivered. "I never promised him anything except that I'd talk to my husband. I never thought it would go this far." A heavy silence settled over us. Outside, a car drove by, headlights casting shifting shadows across our porch. I realized how bizarre this scene must look, a stranger standing on our doorstep, mediating the fallout of my wife's affair. Finally, Melissa exhaled. "Look, I'm not here to cause trouble. Eric is my friend. He's worried, maybe not thinking straight. He asked me to check on Claire because he's afraid she's being forced to cut ties." She glanced at me again, apology flickering in her eyes. "But I can see now that's not what's happening. I'm sorry." I stayed silent, boiling with a mix of resentment and confusion, uncertain how to respond. Claire gave a small nod, blinking back tears. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, "but I'm okay. We both are. At least we're trying to be." Melissa studied Claire's face for a long moment, like she wasn't quite convinced. But then she nodded, seeming to accept the answer. "All right, I'll let Eric know you're safe. But, is there anything you want me to tell him?" Claire's eyes slid toward me. I could see the turmoil behind them, maybe regret, or guilt, or both. Finally, she spoke in a low, trembling tone. "Tell him I'm sorry. And that it's really over." With that, Melissa stepped back off the porch, her posture rigid. I watched her walk down the pathway toward a car parked on the curb. The moment she disappeared behind the glare of headlights, I shut the door. The click of the latch reverberated in the silence. Claire remained rooted by the hallway, eyes fixed on me with a mix of remorse and something like fear. She knew she'd inflicted a wound so deep, I wasn't sure it would ever fully heal. And I didn't know how to meet her gaze without feeling that tangle of heartbreak and anger all over again. I crossed into the living room and sank onto the couch. My head pounded, my thoughts a storm of questions I couldn't even begin to untangle. Claire followed, hesitating on the edge of the room like she wasn't sure if she should come closer or give me space. "You said you ended it," I finally muttered, running a hand through my hair. "But you never mentioned that Eric believed you two had something more. That he thought you might leave me." She faltered, guilt etched onto her features. "I never said I'd leave you," she whispered. "He assumed that. Or maybe I didn't correct him enough at the time. I was confused. I wasn't even sure how to fix my own mess." My chest tightened. There was a time not long ago when the word mess would have meant a pile of unwashed dishes or a cluttered closet. Now it meant the implosion of our marriage, the betrayal I never saw coming. I swallowed, forcing myself to ask the question that had haunted me since I found out. "Did you love him?" Her eyes widened, and tears pooled at the corners. "No," she breathed. "I cared about him, sure, as a friend who understood me in a weird moment of vulnerability. But love. I never stopped loving you." A hollow ache spread through my chest. Her claim should have offered some relief, but it only deepened my confusion. "Then why?" The word came out strangled. I realized how many times I'd asked that same question tonight, how few real answers I'd gotten. "How could you keep doing this if you loved me?" She sank to her knees in front of me, reaching for my hands. Because I was stupid, lost, and for a while, I didn't see what I had right in front of me. "I never intended to hurt you, David. I know that doesn't make it better." Her voice cracked on the last word. She was close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence, the same woman I'd once trusted more than anything in the world. Part of me wanted to push her away, to tell her I needed time, needed to sort out the chaos in my head. But another part, the part still clinging to the memory of us before this nightmare, ached to hold her. I felt split in two, uncertain whether I could ever truly forgive her. We sat there, the hush of the house pressing in, the unanswered question of our future looming. My mind flashed back to the day I married her. The way her eyes shone with hope, the way we both believed we'd tackle every challenge together. Now, I wondered if that promise was shattered beyond repair. I finally drew my hands away from hers, my voice trembling. "I need to figure out if I can move past this," I said. "I can't decide that right now. And Eric, he needs to accept that it's over, that he can't call you, can't send people to our door. We need space." Claire nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I understand," she said softly, as though acknowledging my every word. "I'll do anything you need to feel safe with me again. If that's even possible." I wanted to say something reassuring, to promise that we could rebuild. But I didn't have that reassurance to give. My emotions were a tangled mass of sorrow, anger, and betrayal. Instead, I stood, walked a few steps away, and closed my eyes, trying to steady the gallop of my pulse. Just as I opened my mouth to speak, something jolted my senses. It was a vibration, Claire's phone, lighting up on the coffee table. My heart kicked into high gear. I locked eyes with her, and she looked just as startled. "Answer it," I said quietly, dread pooling in my gut. "If that's him again." She exhaled shakily, picking up the phone. Her expression darkened as she read the caller ID, then turned the screen for me to see. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. It wasn't Eric. It was an unknown number. Still, something about the moment felt wrong, like the universe had decided not to let this night end peacefully. She swallowed, then pressed her thumb to the screen, putting the call on speaker. "Hello," she said, voice trembling. Silence for a beat, then a distorted voice crackled through. "Claire, I know this is a bad time, but you need to hear me out. Eric's not safe. There's something you both have to know." My skin went cold, my gaze snapping to Claire. Her face drained of color, and I could feel her panic rising again. "Who is this?" she asked, her tone bordering on desperation. The caller paused, as if nervous. "You don't know me, but I know Eric. I found something. I think he's in trouble, and by extension, so are you." A chill lanced through the air, so sharp and sudden it felt like the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Eric's name again. Another secret looming in the background. Another voice on the line, telling us we weren't out of the woods yet. In that heart-stopping moment, I realized our ordeal might be far from over, and the next revelation could be even more shattering than the betrayal that nearly ripped us apart. I remember the exact moment I realized there was no going back, that my marriage couldn't be salvaged, no matter how many apologies or late-night conversations Claire and I had. It happened the morning after that mysterious caller warned us about Eric. I'd hardly slept, and when I finally did drift off, I dreamt of tangled phone cords, locked doors, and all the regrets I never thought I'd have. When I woke, a heaviness settled over me like a fog. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, replaying every memory. Our wedding day, the time we spent hunting for our first home, the easy laughter we used to share on quiet Sunday mornings. Then I recalled the chain of events leading to her betrayal, the hushed phone calls, the hotel key, and my heart clenched so painfully, it was hard to breathe. Something had broken between us, and no words could make it whole again. I got up, walked into the hallway, and saw Claire leaning against the wall, eyes rimmed with shadows. She attempted a sad, hopeful smile, but I felt numb. We both knew this wasn't a temporary rift anymore. It was the end of our life as we'd known it. Neither of us said a word. Eventually, I slipped past her, grabbed my car keys, and drove off, the silence in the house echoing behind me. I spent most of that day in my car, driving aimlessly through the city until I ended up at the park where I used to play pickup basketball years ago. No one was on the court. The chain-link fence rattled in the wind, and the echo of a solitary crow overhead gave the place a haunted feel. I parked under an old oak tree, killed the engine, and let out a shuddering breath. That was when I decided I had to file for divorce. The idea of ending our marriage was like ripping out a piece of my own soul. But the alternative, living in a home built on lies and shattered trust, felt worse. If Claire had truly loved me in the way a wife should, there would have been no Eric, no secrets. She said it was over, but the damage was done. Maybe we could have tried counseling or therapy, but I knew in my gut that the foundation of our relationship had already crumbled. I called a lawyer I found through a referral from an old college friend. My hands shook as I left a voicemail, my voice thick with the realization of what I was doing. Once I'd hung up, a strange sense of calm settled over me. There was no more guessing, no more lingering tension about what would come next. This was the road I had to take, painful as it was. Back home, Claire was sitting in the living room with puffy eyes and a tissue clenched in her hand. I told her in a voice I barely recognized, "I'm filing for divorce." She broke down, weeping so hard it physically hurt to watch. There was nothing satisfying in her tears, only a hollow ache that ached deeper as I listened to her sob. But I didn't back down. I couldn't. For the next few weeks, the house became a silent battleground. Claire stayed in the guest room most nights. I slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of what might have been. Occasionally, we'd speak in clipped, practical tones about the lawyer, about splitting our belongings. Some days, it felt like we were drifting in separate lifeboats after a shipwreck, each trying not to sink. On others, we'd stand in the hallway, gazes meeting, regret etched into every line of our faces, silently acknowledging the love we once had. I didn't care about Eric's drama anymore. The mysterious caller, the warnings, the complications. I realized they were part of a life that no longer concerned me. Claire had chosen that path, and I needed to find one of my own. So, I started taking steps to reclaim my identity. For months, maybe years, I'd poured so much of myself into our marriage that I'd let my own interests slip away. I reached out to people I hadn't seen in a while, old friends from high school, acquaintances from my last job, even a couple of cousins I'd lost touch with. One Friday night, a friend named Marcus invited me out for a beer. It felt alien at first, forcing myself to socialize when my heart was still raw. But as the night wore on, I found myself laughing at old inside jokes, rediscovering a part of me that wasn't tied to Claire's existence. I also dug into a hobby I'd abandoned years ago, woodworking. It had been a passion of mine before marriage duties and full-time work consumed my schedule. I cleared out the clutter in our garage, soon to be my garage, and set up a small station. The smell of fresh-cut wood and the hum of a power sander grounded me in a way I hadn't felt for a long time. Each evening, I'd lose myself in crafting a new table leg or finishing a piece of reclaimed lumber, the rhythmic motions giving me a sense of control over something in my life. Meanwhile, the process of divorce moved forward slowly. Lawyers exchanged paperwork, Claire and I had tense discussions about finances, and we arranged to split what we'd worked so hard to earn together. It was painful watching certain items go, things I associated with shared memories, a photo album from our honeymoon, the sofa we bought when we first moved in. But with every box that left the house, a small weight lifted. I couldn't change the past, but I could reclaim my future. In an attempt to breathe new life into my surroundings, I started changing things around the house. I sold some of the old furniture we'd picked out together, replacing it with pieces that matched my own taste. Modern, minimal, and bright. I painted the living room walls a lighter hue, letting more sunlight bounce around. I rearranged the bedroom, moving the bed to a different corner and adding bold artwork that spoke to me. There was no more constant reminder of her preferences or our shared decisions. It became a reflection of who I was becoming now, someone standing on his own 2 feet. Little by little, a sense of renewal took hold. I'd wake up in the morning, make a cup of coffee, and sit by the window, noticing how the new color on the walls caught the dawn light. It was a small thing, but it made me feel good, like I was taking ownership of my life again. Through all this, Claire and I maintained a civil, if distant, relationship, especially when it came to finalizing the legalities. The heartbreak wasn't gone. There were days I'd catch a glimpse of her in the hallway, or hear her softly cry in the spare room, and an ache of old love would squeeze my chest. But I forced myself to remember that trust was shattered, that this was our inevitable path. We both deserved a chance to start over, even if that meant going our separate ways. Eventually, the day came to sign the final divorce papers. I did it in the lawyer's office, pen scratching across the lines that severed our marriage. As I set down the pen, I felt a shiver run through me, loss and relief entwined. I glanced at Claire, who signed her name with trembling fingers. We exchanged a brief, wordless look, as if to say, asterisk, we tried. We really did, asterisk. That night, I sat alone in the house that was now solely mine. I thought I'd feel emptier, but instead I felt a cautious, curious sense of freedom, like standing at the brink of a wide-open field. For the first time in what felt like ages, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was no longer stuck in limbo. I picked up my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and sent out a message in the group chat I'd made with some friends. Anyone up for a weekend road trip? In the end, I'd lost the marriage I once believed would last forever. Yet as the days passed, I realized that the world hadn't ended. Yes, the betrayal had been agonizing, like a deep wound that left a permanent scar. But it also forced me to acknowledge parts of myself I'd let wither away. It reminded me that no matter how tightly you cling to someone, if trust and mutual respect vanish, it's time to move on. One evening, after finishing a new wood project in the garage, I walked outside and took in the sky, its fading palette of oranges and pinks giving way to twilight. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, and I felt a quiet stirring of hope. Maybe I'd have to face loneliness for a while. Maybe I'd have some hard nights ahead, wondering if I made the right call. But I also had a second chance to learn who I was and what I wanted, free from secrets and deception. Standing there in the dusk, I realized something. Endings aren't always bad. Sometimes they're the painful push we need to rewrite our story. My marriage to Claire was over, but I wasn't. I might have lost the life I thought I was meant to have, but I'd gained an opportunity to rediscover myself, to chase the dreams I'd shelved for too long. With that thought blazing in my mind, I turned back toward the house. It felt different now, lighter, more spacious. This was the place where I'd rebuild, one small step at a time. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since discovering Claire's betrayal, a spark of optimism glowed inside me. I would heal. I would learn to trust again, maybe even love again. And in the process, I'd become a better, stronger version of myself. I locked the door behind me, walked into the living room painted in my chosen color, and allowed myself a careful, genuine smile. Yes, life could be messy and cruel, but it was also forgiving. And as I stood in the glow of a single lamp, I decided that this was my new beginning, a promise to keep moving forward, no matter how uncertain the path.